I'm very excited to make a return to the world of PlayStation Portable emulation with the amazing PPSSPP emulator for Android, and it's been a long time since I've done a dedicated PSP showcase. But thanks to newcomer Mangmi and the Air X handheld, we now have a device that is capable of some serious PSP emulation at a price point that won't break the bank, with performance not before seen in the budget and under $100 segment. The Mangmi Air X is an upcoming handheld with a 5.5-inch 16:9 1080p display that features the Snapdragon 662, and while this may not be a high-end chipset, it's a very exciting development and a step forward for handhelds in the budget segment. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore the capabilities of the Air X and dive into PlayStation Portable emulation, and find out if the Air X is the budget-friendly Super PlayStation Portable. So I want to keep things nice and simple and just quickly go over a few settings to familiarize yourself for this showcase, since I will be detailing the settings that I recommend using for each game as we go through this video. For this showcase, I am using PPSSPP Gold version 1.19.3, but the standard PPSSPP will give you the same results. Alright, so here on the game screen we have all the game icons, and to the right, let's focus in on the settings option and go through this very quickly. We will be using the Vulkan backend as the default. Now there are a few games that will require OpenGL, and I will let you know, but Vulkan is a good starting point for PSP with this device. For the rendering resolution, I recommend starting with 2x, which again is a good starting point, and we definitely will have games that can either go higher than this, or some that might just need the native 1x resolution, and I'll let you know all this throughout. So scrolling down, we can completely skip over the frame skipping section, since we will not be using any of that for this video, which is definitely good news for the Air X. Now, be mindful of the speed hack section, since there are a couple of games that will need a setting or two adjusted, such as the skip GPU rebacks option, and if I talk about that in the showcase, this is where you can go to adjust the settings. Right now, for our default settings, leave everything alone and just don't make any changes. Now, if you scroll all the way down, you can toggle on the FPS overlay if you want that information. Okay, so controls, audio, networking, and tools will all be skipped over here, since we will be leaving all that alone. Now, PPSSPP automatically detects the built-in controls on the Air X, so we actually don't need to worry about any of that. Instead, let's focus in on the system section, and here I do want to make two changes. The first thing we want to do is scroll down until we get to the emulation section, and then change the emulated PSP's CPU clock speed to 333 MHz. For the most part, I haven't had issues with this for the games in this showcase, but I will let you know if any of them need that setting set to default. Not only that, but PPSSPP will usually let you know when you start a game that it should be set to default. Now, I do like having this set to 333 since many games will automatically run better and at 60 frames per second. Now, the second change I want to make here is to enable the cheats option. And finally, let's just double check that the PSP model is set to 2000/3000. So let's now go back to the game screen and talk about setting per game changes, which is very helpful for any games that need a specific tweak, or perhaps run better than the default 2x upscaling we've set as our default. I'll use Daxter as an example, since I don't have a game-specific config yet for it, which is denoted by the gear icon in the bottom left of the game's icon. If you tap and hold the game's icon, eventually you will be taken to a new screen for that game specifically. And to the right, we have a few options, and because we haven't created a specific game config for Daxter, we can tap on Create Game Config, and now it changes to Game Settings, and we can make changes that will only impact the specific game. For example, let's say I want Daxter to run at 4 times the native PSP resolution, so I can make the change here, and now only Daxter will run at 4x. And since we enabled the cheats option in system already, we can now make use of cheat codes that can help with performance, and in many cases give us a better experience, such as running games at a full 60 frames per second. Now, I will share the cheat database file that I'm using for this video in the description, but just tap on the cheats and then import the cheats.db file from the PSP/cheats folder. Lastly, every game in this showcase is running with the newly added performance mode option on the Air X using the extreme fan setting. Alright, so that's it for our settings overview. Now for this game's showcase, I selected 25 games from various genres, but I really wanted to focus in on more demanding PSP titles, as well as games that I know run at 60 frames per second natively, with a little sprinkle of some of my personal favorite games. The PSP library is huge and just full of amazing games, but I think the titles in this video will be a fairly strong representation of what we can expect with most of the PSP library, which based on what I've seen so far is a very good thing for the Mangmi Air X. So let's start up with a little cult classic action, and a game that I don't believe I've ever talked about before on the channel with The Third Birthday, which is a semi-reboot / side story to the Parasite Eve series. Yes, the same Parasite Eve games back from the PlayStation 1 days that just kinda disappeared. Now, unlike the PS1 games, this one leans more into third-person shooter territory, and once again you follow Aya Brea as she dives into bodies across time to stop grotesque creatures called the Twisted. The combat mixes cover-based gunplay with a body-hopping mechanic that's still super unique to this day. The Third Birthday runs incredibly well here, with the Air X running at 4 times the native PSP resolution for an equivalent of 1080p, which matches the Air X's display, and it definitely cleans up nicely and looks great. It's almost impossible to talk about PSP emulation and not mention Burnout, and while Legends often gets the spotlight, Burnout Dominator is still a pretty fun entry that I wanted to use this showcase to feature. This game strips away the beloved crash mode and doubles down on chaining boosts, insane drifting, and of course ruthless takedowns. It's a pure arcade racer at heart, and while it's not my favorite Burnout entry, it is still a pretty impressive PSP title, at least in terms of graphics. For Dominator, we can make use of a 60 frames per second cheat code, and the Air X can actually handle this frame rate while still enjoying 2 times the native PlayStation Portable resolution, which means that we could alternatively go with the standard 30 frames per second frame rate and then go with a higher upscaling. If there's one PSP title that needs no introduction, it's Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, and it's not much of a surprise given it's a prequel to one of the most legendary RPGs of all time, giving us a closer look at Zack Fair. Originally released in 2007, this game was a technical marvel for the PSP, with cinematic cutscenes and a battle system that bridged the gap between turn-based RPGs and action combat. On the Air X, we can run this game with as much as 3 times the PSP resolution with a 60 frames per second cheat code. I did test this with as much as 4X, but there were more noticeable dips at this level of upscaling, so I do think 3X is the better way to go, which is still incredible given the 60 frames per second improvement. Def Jam Fight for New York: The Takeover brings Def Jam Fight for New York to the PSP and is a portable port that not only includes all the features from its home console version, but also adds a few new features and is a really well done version of the game. Def Jam Fight for New York was developed by Aki Corporation, the same studio responsible for some of the best wrestling games back on the Nintendo 64 like WWF No Mercy and WrestleMania. And so if you're a fan of the engine and gameplay style of those games, you will feel very much at home with this one. It's an unusual combination of the world of Def Jam with a wrestling fighting game style and a surprisingly solid storyline. The PSP version is already running at 60 frames per second natively, and amazingly with the Air X, we can go as high as 4 times the native PSP resolution, which is the equivalent of 1080p and matches the Air X's display. And as a result, the game looks absolutely crisp and runs very well. PSP was home to a lot of ports as well as portable versions of popular console titles, and EA Sports' Fight Night Round 3 has always been a fan favorite, and an excellent boxing game that received a portable version thanks to the PSP. Now, despite the lack of a second analog stick, the developers did a good job handling the PSP version, and this is a solid port that has really great graphics. In fact, the PSP version runs at 60 frames per second natively, so there's no need for any cheat codes, and with this one, I'd say about 3 times the native PSP resolution is the best bet, since there were some frame dips for me at 4X, but regardless, that is solid performance, especially for a game running at 60 frames per second. Now, we're not quite done yet with Final Fantasy, and before it ever got its official HD remaster, Final Fantasy Type 0 was probably one of the most ambitious PSP titles Square Enix ever released, but unfortunately it never left Japan in its original form. But that didn't stop the fan translation community, which stepped in and gave us English-speaking players a way to experience it. This game is part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis subseries, the same mythos that spawned Final Fantasy XIII and XV, but unlike those, Type 0 is darker, bloodier, and far more militaristic. You take control of Class 0, a group of elite cadets thrown into a brutal war, swapping between 14 unique playable characters, each with their own combat style and weapons. Given how ambitious this game was, I wasn't too surprised that we'd be running this at 2 times the native PSP resolution, but that's with a 60 frames per second cheat code, which is very impressive and allows us to not only enjoy higher frame rates, but some upscaling. As always, you can opt to leave the frame rate at default and then get away with a bit more upscaling. Of course, it wouldn't be a PSP Emulation showcase without everyone's favorite benchmarking game, and God of War Chains of Olympus yet again makes a return to the channel, but I'd say that this is going to be a first in the sense that we've never seen this level of performance for this game on a handheld under $100. There's not much that needs to be said about Chains of Olympus, since it really needs no introduction and is one of the premier titles for the PSP and really demonstrated what can be done with this amazing handheld. For Chains of Olympus, I am running at a 2 times native PSP resolution, and this is another game that does support 60 frames per second natively. And for a lot of budget handhelds, especially those that were under $100, typically we would have to do things like run a 30 frames per second cheat, but no more of that here. We are able to enjoy some upscaling and the native 60 frames per second. And when there's Chains of Olympus, naturally there will be its sequel Ghost of Sparta, which is an even more demanding game than Chains of Olympus for PSP emulation. If Chains of Olympus showed us that Kratos could rule the PSP, Ghost of Sparta proved that the system hadn't even hit its limits yet. The sequel runs on a refined engine that pushes the handheld's visuals to near console levels with better everything across the board. Now despite all this, the experience is much of the same with the Air X, and just like Chains of Olympus, we can push this one to use 2 times the native PSP resolution, and Ghost of Sparta also supports 60 frames per second natively, which means that just like Chains of Olympus, we have yet another game that can enjoy upscaling without the need for any specific tweaks or cheat codes for performance. I very vividly remember anticipating the release of Gran Turismo for PSP, and when it finally arrived in 2009, I couldn't believe that the masters at Polyphony Digital somehow managed to pack the same level of detail, realistic handling, and massive amount of tracks and cars into this portable package. This is truly the real driving simulator, and not just some spin-off game, that visually is an absolute stunner, especially when enjoyed with PPSSPP. I'm actually pleasantly surprised by the performance of this game on the Air X, which can manage as much as 3 times the native PSP resolution, and when you combine that with the 60 frames per second that the game runs at natively, this is an awesome experience that is now possible on a budget device. I did test my usual 2 favorite tracks, which also happens to represent where I was born and raised, and where I live now and have frequented many times. Killzone Liberation is an absolutely awesome take on the Killzone franchise, which was developed directly by Guerrilla Games, and instead of trying to cram the PS2's first-person shooter formula onto the PSP, instead Guerrilla reinvented the Killzone series as an isometric tactical shooter, which would go on to become one of the most polished and unique PSP exclusives ever made. Killzone Liberation is definitely one of the most demanding titles on PSP with emulation using PPSSPP, and for this game I am using 2 times the native PSP resolution, which pleasantly surprised me given how demanding this game can be, and this is another title that runs at 60 frames per second natively, and it's another win for the Air X since we can enjoy this game with some level of upscaling to clean up the visuals. Metal Gear was surprisingly well represented on the PSP with some interesting titles like Metal Gear Acid, but the one I wanted to focus in on for this showcase was Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, which in many ways is the crown jewel of the PSP Metal Gear games. Directed by Hideo Kojima himself, Peace Walker isn't just a side story, it's considered part of the mainline Metal Gear Solid games. It expands Big Boss's story between Snake Eater and Ground Zeroes, introducing the base building mechanics that will later become a core part of the Phantom Pain. This one was designed for a handheld in mind, and so missions were designed for portable play, but of course still carry the cinematic flair, depth, and over-the-top boss encounters that define the series. On the Air X, we've got excellent performance here, and I am set to use 2 times the native PSP resolution as well as a 60 frames per second cheat code, so not only do we get better frame rates, but we also get to enjoy this game with upscaling that looks just phenomenal with this game. I do recommend switching to OpenGL for this game since it does have some issues with Vulkan, which can crash the game at certain points. Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition was Rockstar's love letter to car culture of the mid-2000s, which featured licensed rides, deep customization, and sprawling city maps inspired by Detroit, San Diego, and Atlanta. Like so many popular game series, the PSP port of Midnight Club 3 is a technical feat that somehow manages to bring over the console experience. Because of this, the game is also very demanding to emulate. Unfortunately, Midnight Club 3 doesn't handle its native 60 frames per second well, no matter what settings I used, and there aren't any 30 frames per second cheat codes for this game that I'm aware of. So instead, I recommend setting the emulated PSP's CPU clock speed under System in PPSSP settings to 150. What this does is it tricks the game into holding a stable 30 frames per second at all times, which is much easier for the Air X to manage, and because of that we can run this game with as much as 3 times the native PSP resolution, so while we can't quite hit full speed at 60, we can at least enjoy this game with much improved visuals, which it definitely benefits from. And of course we've got to follow up with Midnight Club LA Remix, which this time around drops you into a condensed but still impressive Los Angeles to tear through, plus bonus races in Tokyo, all packed with traffic, shortcuts, and that signature Midnight Club sense of speed. Much like Dub Edition, this game is demanding, and just like its predecessor, it doesn't quite run at full speed when using the native resolution and its native 60 frames per second. Unlike Midnight Club 3, there are cheat codes to force that 30 frames per second target, which will give us a much more stable experience, and like Midnight Club 3, we can then go as high as 3 times the native PSP resolution with this option enabled in the cheats section. Again, I think the trade-off is well worth it, and it allows us to enjoy some really crispy visuals with this game, which is a real treat despite the 30 frames per second target. It's pretty remarkable how many great racing games came out on the PlayStation Portable, and one franchise from the PS3 that surprisingly made its way over to the PSP was MotorStorm, with an exclusive entry called Arctic Edge that was later ported to the PlayStation 2. Arctic Edge brings the same awesome gameplay intact, but with a cold, unforgiving twist, and instead of desert dust and bunny tracks, you're racing against icy cliffs, snowdrifts, and avalanches. In terms of PSP emulation, Arctic Edge has always been one of the more demanding and troublesome games to run with PPSSPP, but with some very minor tweaking, we can get Arctic Edge running great here with the Air X. So for this game, I recommend making just one simple change to the settings, and under the Skip GPU Rebacks option, change it to use the Skip option. Other than that, we can enjoy this one at 2 times the native PSP resolution. Unfortunately, I tried the 60 frames per second cheat code that's available, but it's not quite full speed even at native PSP resolution, so I think it's best to keep this one at the default 30 and then enjoy some upscaling, which this game definitely benefits from. Obscure the Aftermath is the kind of horror game that feels like a love letter to cheesy 90s teen slasher movies, except here you're the one that's actually trying to keep the cast alive. This sequel to the cult hit Obscure follows a new group of college students who find themselves tangled in a nightmare involving strange black flowers, disturbing mutations, and a rapidly escalating body count. The PSP port came out a little bit after the initial release on PC, PS2, and Wii, and is an impressive port that kept the console version intact. On the Air X, we're able to run this game with as much as 3 times the native PSP resolution, and best of all, there's a 60 frames per second cheat code, so not only do we get the improved visuals with this game, but we are able to double the frame rate from 30 to 60 while still enjoying that level of upscaling, and performance is really solid with this game. We've got some racing goodness coming in with some Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast, which is certainly no stranger to the channel and easily one of my favorite racing games, and this one is just pure arcade racing bliss that is a blast to play with gorgeous visuals, an awesome soundtrack, and a dream selection of Ferraris to choose from. Nothing beats the pure joy of nailing those perfect drifts, dodging traffic, and watching as the scenery passes you by at a blistering 60 frames per second. This is a pretty demanding game, and it's awesome to see it running here at 60 frames per second using 2 times the native PSP resolution. Now for this one, you're going to want to make sure that you have the emulated CPU speed set to 333 MHz, as discussed in the beginning of the video, so that the game stays at that 60 frames per second. Pursuit Force Extreme Justice is easily one of the most over-the-top action games on the PSP, which is part high-speed chaser, part third-person shooter, and part Hollywood stunt reel. You're leaping from car to car, taking down criminals, and everything from speedboats to armored trucks, all with explosive set pieces that would make a Michael Bay movie blush. Extreme Justice is actually the sequel to the original Pursuit Force, and amazingly both games have never been ported anywhere else. So they are true PSP exclusives, and a lot of fun to play. They are available as part of the Classics catalog now for PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, and I would love to see these games get a proper remaster one day. On the Air X, I am set to use 2 times the native PSP resolution, but you'll want to keep it locked at 30 frames per second using the cheat code. Unfortunately, 60 frames per second is just slightly too demanding. My other recommendation is to head into PPSSPP's graphic settings and set Skip GPU Rebacks to skip, and with that, the game looks and runs really well. Resistance Retribution brings the franchise over from the PlayStation 3 in a completely reimagined form. Instead of a first-person shooter, this entry opts for a third-person perspective, which makes sense given the PSP's control scheme. You play as James Grayson, a British soldier who joins the European resistance against the Chimera after a personal tragedy. The game blends cover-based firefights with cinematic set pieces, and it manages to capture the atmosphere of the console games while still feeling tailored for portable play. With the Air X, we can go as much as 3 times the native PSP resolution, but like Pursuit Force Extreme Justice, we will want to make use of the 30 frames per second cheat code for consistent performance, as 60 frames per second is simply too much for the hardware even at native resolution. Now finally, just like Pursuit Force, you will also want to change the skip GPU rebacks to skip in PPSSPP's graphic settings. Silent Hill Origins takes the series' trademark psychological horror and packs it into a haunting prequel for the PlayStation Portable, and as such is set before the events of the original Silent Hill. For this game, you step into the boots of Travis Grady, a truck driver drawn into the cursed town while searching for the truth behind a mysterious fire and the strange little girl he rescues from it. Despite being developed by Climax Studios, this one definitely remains true to the franchise and features the disturbing creature designs and unsettling environments that the series is best known for. It was developed for the PSP first, with a port to the PlayStation 2 later on, but this game really pulls off some impressive visuals for the hardware, and is a fairly demanding PSP game to emulate. On the Air X, we are set to use 2 times the native PSP resolution while enjoying the full 60 frames per second that the game supports natively. Climax Studios wasn't quite done with the Silent Hill franchise, and returned with another entry that received a PSP version. Silent Hill Shattered Memories was an opportunity for Climax Studios to break away from the classic formula of the series that they so lovingly put together for Origins, and instead used Shattered Memories as a way to reimagine the original Silent Hill game. Of course, many of the signature features of a Silent Hill game are still present here, including the soundtrack composed by Akira Yamaoka, which also happens to be the first in the series to feature dynamic music. Unfortunately, Shattered Memories does not fare as well as Origins, and has always been a bit of a problem for PPSSPP on Android, especially for lower-end hardware. For this game, I did switch over to the OpenGL backend to address the glitches with the flashlight, but this game does struggle to maintain a consistent framerate, which targets 60 and really cannot be adjusted in any way to improve performance. If there's one thing that's for sure, just putting this showcase together served as a really good reminder of just how amazingly well served the racing genre was on the PSP, with tons of big name franchises that made its way over. Now, Split Second is definitely not a big name franchise. In fact, it never really had a chance to become a franchise, which is really a shame, since it's an incredible racing game that leans heavily into the cinematics with big explosions, collapsing buildings, and crashing airplanes that are all triggered by you in an effort to destroy your rivals and change the track layout in real time. It was a very ambitious game on the home consoles, where it released for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC, and the sheer fact that this PSP port exists and manages to retain much of what made it great on the home consoles is nothing short of amazing. Split Second is today an overlooked gem of a racing game that should be on your list of PSP games to check out. And what's really impressive that this game somehow manages to run at 2 times the native PSP resolution at a target frame rate of 60 using the cheat code available for it, with just very minor dips here and there. I really want to check out at least one fighting game for this showcase, and Tekken 6 in many ways is a great one to show off, since much like many of the other entries for this video, Tekken 6 on the PSP is sort of a miracle of a port, somehow cramming in the full package with a complete roster, excellent graphics, and fluid combat animations of its console counterparts. It's truly another testament to just how impressive the hardware of the PSP was at the time, and why its library is so dang good. On the Air X, we can comfortably bump up the resolution to as much as 3 times the native PSP resolution, which really makes this game shine with visuals that are super sharp, and best of all, this game runs at 60 frames per second natively, without any need for cheat codes or tweaks. For this game, it is recommended to set the emulated CPU clock speed to default in the PPSSPP settings, since it can cause some issues for this game specifically. I bet you wouldn't believe it if I told you that the last set of games for this showcase are all racing games, and the reality is that a lot of the racing games on PSP were really good benchmarks of the capabilities of the PSP, and as such, many of them are pretty demanding to emulate as well. When Test Drive Unlimited landed on the PSP, it brought something rare to the handheld racing scene, an open world map that you could explore at your own pace. Set in a scaled-down version of Oahu, Hawaii, you could cruise scenic highways, tear through city streets, or challenge other drivers, like Russ from Retro Game Corps, along the way. This was a benchmark game when it first released on the Xbox 360 and PC, and honestly it was probably a bit too ambitious for the PlayStation Portable. Now, the beautiful thing about emulation is that we can now experience this game in the best way possible. So we do have a few options with this one, and you can opt to use a 60 frames per second cheat code, but then you'll have to stick to the native PlayStation Portable resolution. My personal preference though is to use the 30 frames per second cheat code instead, and then crank the upscaling to as much as 3 times the native PSP resolution, which this game really benefits from the cleaned up visuals. Wipeout Pure is one of my favorite go-to games for PSP emulation, and naturally I had to feature here for this showcase since while this isn't the most demanding PSP game, it can surprisingly be a bit more difficult to run when you're trying to keep that 60 frames per second consistently. I know I'm going slightly out of order here, but it makes sense to go with Wipeout Pure first, since this was the first Wipeout game on the PSP and was actually a launch title, which is kind of amazing to think about, given how graphically impressive this game still is to this day. The PSP Wipeout games are easily some of the best in the franchise. This game does something similar to Outrun, where it will switch between 30 and 60 frames per second in-game, so I definitely recommend using the cheat code to force it to stay at that 60 frames per second target consistently, since we do have enough power on hand here to enjoy the higher frame rates as well as being able to use 2 times the native PSP resolution with that higher frame rate. And of course I can't think of a better way to wrap this showcase up than with the sequel, Wipeout Pulse, which really took Wipeout to the next level on the PSP since everything here feels faster, sleeker, and packs even more content than before. It built on the series' trademark anti-gravity racing with somehow even sharper visuals and a deeper single-player campaign. Now unlike Pure, we don't need any cheat codes to lock in the higher frame rate for Pulse, which does run at a consistent 60 frames per second right out of the box on the Air X. And much like Pure, we can get away with 2 times the native PSP resolution, so everything here looks really clean and sharp and lets those impressive visuals shine through. And that does it for our PSP showcase with the Mangmi Air X, which now has clearly set the new benchmark for what we can expect with a budget handheld, and while the Snapdragon 6X2 may not be a flagship chip, it's proven to be more than capable to handle a good portion of the PlayStation Portable library, and I'm very excited to keep exploring what else is possible with this new budget contender. Were you surprised by the performance here with the Air X, and what would you like to see me test next? Until the next time, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.